The city moved on the night Melissa Dillon lost control of her car, unaware that a single intersection had become the point where multiple fragile narratives finally collided. It was not a dramatic moment in the way people often imagine turning points to be. No slow motion, no cinematic silence. Just rain-slick asphalt, blurred headlights, and a split-second lapse in judgment that transformed emotional instability into physical consequence. Witnesses would later describe it differently depending on what they believe they had seen. A sudden swerve, a missed signal, a truck that appeared too large too quickly. But what could not be disputed was impact. The sound of metal folding into metal. The abrupt collapse of motion into stillness. And then silence again, broken only by the distant hum of traffic that refused to stop for tragedy. When emergency responders arrived, Melissa was still inside the vehicle, barely conscious, her breathing uneven, her hands still gripping the wheel, as though letting go would confirm something irreversible about what had just happened. Paramedics worked quickly, their voices clipped and procedural, stabilizing her before extraction. "She's losing blood pressure," one of them said. "Possible internal trauma," another added. But what none of them documented aloud was the emotional condition preceding the accident. Because emotion is not part of emergency protocol, even when it is the cause. At Forrester Creations, news travels faster than official communication. It arrived first as rumor, then as confirmation, then as silence that replaced all ongoing conversation. RJ was the one who heard it first in the design floor, his expression shifting immediately as he looked up from the sketches in front of him. Electra noticed before he spoke. "What is it?" she asked. RJ hesitated, then said it. Melissa was in an accident. The room changed temperature instantly. Not physically, but perceptually, because some names do that now. They reorganize emotional space. Well, Spencer did not hear about it through official channels either. He was mid-meeting at Spencer Enterprises when the call came through. A brief interruption. A name. A location. A condition. Critical. And for a moment, everything else in the room ceased to matter. Bill noticed immediately. "What happened?" he asked. But what was already standing, already moving, already leaving before the full sentence had even finished forming in anyone else's mind. The hospital did not feel like a place of resolution when Will arrived. It felt like suspended consequence. White corridors, controlled urgency, doors that opened and closed without emotional acknowledgement of what lay behind them. Electra arrived shortly after, and RJ even later. They did not enter together. They did not need to, because they were already converging on the same point of instability. Melissa Dillon. Inside the emergency wing, Melissa was undergoing surgery. Her condition listed as critical. Unstable, but survivable, depending on variables no one could yet predict. Will stood outside the glass barrier of the ICU for a long time without speaking. Electra approached slowly. "You didn't know she was driving like that," she said quietly. Will didn't respond immediately, because that wasn't the question forming inside him. The question was not about accident. It was about accumulation, and what had led her to that point. "I should have seen it," he said finally. Electra frowned slightly. "Seen what?" Will's voice lowered. "Everything." That answer did not satisfy her. In fact, it unsettled her more, because responsibility expressed in totality is rarely about single events. It is about emotional entanglement that predates visible consequence. And Electra understood, in a way she did not want to, that Melissa was no longer just a third party in their conflict. She was becoming a center of gravity. RJ arrived just as doctors updated Melissa's condition. Survived surgery. Still unstable. Still unconscious. But alive. The word alive did not feel reassuring in that context. It felt temporary. Later, in the hospital corridor, tension began forming again between the three of them. Not immediately explosive, but heavy, dense. The kind of tension that accumulates from unresolved emotional trajectories rather than single statements. Electra was the first to speak. "This is getting out of control," she said quietly. Will didn't look at her. "I know," he replied. RJ frowned. "Do you?" he asked. That question changed the direction of the conversation because it implied divergence in interpretation. We'll turn slightly toward RJ. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. RJ hesitated, then said it, that this isn't just bad timing anymore. Silence followed, because timing implies randomness. And randomness was no longer a convincing explanation. Meanwhile, somewhere within the hospital system, another observer was quietly absorbing information. Ivy Forrester, still recovering from her own prior collapse, still embedded within Forrester's fragile internal structure, and increasingly aware that attention elsewhere meant opportunity elsewhere. When she heard about Melissa's accident, her reaction was not grief. It was recalibration. Because in systems of emotional competition, distraction is often advantage. If everyone is focused on her, Ivy murmured to herself, then no one is looking at anything else. And what anything else referred to remained unspoken, but not unimportant. Back at Forrester Creations, Ridge tried to stabilize internal operations, but the ripple effect was immediate. Elektra's presence became emotionally destabilizing for RJ. RJ's focus became divided between personal concern and structural suspicion. And Ridge himself found his authority being subtly undermined not by external competitors, but by internal emotional fragmentation that no corporate policy could contain. At Spencer Enterprises, Bill observed Will carefully. "You're involved in this more than you should be," Bill said at one point. Will didn't deny it. "I know," he replied. Bill studied him for a moment. "This is starting to look personal again," he said. Will finally looked at him. "It was always personal," he said quietly. That statement marked a shift, because it acknowledged what had been increasingly unavoidable. The overlap between emotional systems and corporate strategy was no longer separable. When Melissa finally regained partial consciousness days later, the first name she asked for was Will. Not Elektra, not RJ, not anyone else. Just Will. And that detail, once recorded, changed everything again. Elektra learned about it shortly after. She did not react immediately, not because she lacked emotion, but because emotion had begun to lose clarity under repeated pressure. Instead, she simply asked. She asked for him? RJ nodded slowly. Yes. And something inside Elektra tightened. Not jealousy alone, not insecurity alone, but recognition that emotional attachment, once reactivated, cannot be controlled by logic. Will visited Melissa that night, alone. The hospital room was quiet, dimly lit, machines tracking recovery in steady rhythm. When she saw him, she attempted to speak immediately, but struggled. Will stepped closer. "Don't," he said softly. "Just stay still." But Melissa shook her head slightly. "I thought you wouldn't come," she whispered. Will hesitated, then said quietly, "I should have been there before." That statement carried weight neither of them fully unpacked in the moment. Outside the room, Elektra watched from a distance, not entering, not interrupting, just observing the emotional configuration forming inside a space she no longer felt part of. And for the first time, she understood something with painful clarity. This was no longer a triangle. It was a realignment. And in realignment, someone is always displaced. Ivy, watching from her own recovery isolation, smiled faintly when she heard that Will had visited Melissa. Because in her mind, every emotional reattachment elsewhere meant reduced scrutiny elsewhere. And reduced scrutiny meant opportunity. Opportunity to reposition herself within Forrester Creations. Opportunity to restore influence. Opportunity to ensure that when attention returned to past events, her events, it would arrive too late to matter. But what none of them fully understood yet was that Melissa Dillon's accident had not simplified anything. It had multiplied instability, because now every emotional connection inside this network carried a new variable: survival. And survival changes the rules of loyalty faster than any argument ever could. The emergency room did not feel like a place where identity could remain stable. It was too bright in some places, too dim in others, a controlled chaos of monitored machines, urgent footsteps, and voices that never rose above professional restraint, even when the situation demanded something closer to panic. Melissa Dillon had been brought in already slipping between thresholds, consciousness and unconsciousness, stability and collapse, life and the thin, unpredictable margin that separates survival from loss. The accident itself had been violent enough to rewrite the physical narrative of her body in seconds. But what followed inside the hospital turned out to be even more complicated, because trauma, in medical terms, is not only about injury. It is about what the body can no longer sustain without external intervention. And Melissa's body was now failing in ways that required something the hospital did not have. "We need O-negative immediately," one of the doctors said, scanning the charts again as if repetition might produce a different result. A nurse shook her head. "There's no compatible reserve available in the system right now." Another voice, sharper this time, cut through the corridor. "Her condition is deteriorating." The words were not dramatic. They were procedural. But in a room where every word carried consequence, procedure was indistinguishable from urgency. Outside the operating area, Will Spencer stood motionless. Electra was beside him, but slightly distanced, as though instinctively aware that proximity alone could no longer stabilize the emotional pressure building between them. RJ arrived minutes later, breath still uneven from rushing through the hospital corridors. But none of them spoke immediately, because language felt insufficient in the presence of medical uncertainty. Instead, they watched, and waited, and absorbed the silence that only hospitals can produce when something essential is being lost too quickly to negotiate with. Then came the announcement. "We cannot proceed without compatible blood," the attending physician said. "Without transfusion, her survival window is narrowing rapidly." A pause, then another sentence, quieter but heavier. "Her blood type is extremely rare." That changed the atmosphere instantly. Not emotionally, structurally. Because rare blood types are not just medical details. They're logistical crises. Electra turned slightly toward Will. "What does that mean?" she asked softly. Will did not answer immediately, because he already understood what it meant. It meant limitation. It meant absence of control. It meant that no amount of corporate power, emotional leverage, or urgency could override biological constraint. And that realization, for someone like Will Spencer, was deeply destabilizing. "It means we don't have time," he said finally. And then, as if the universe had decided to introduce a variable no one had accounted for, a new presence entered the hospital corridor. Remy Price. He did not arrive with urgency. He did not run. He did not appear panicked. He simply walked in as though he had been expected, as though his presence belonged to the architecture of the situation rather than interrupting it. And for a moment, everything around him seemed to adjust subtly in response. Not visibly, but perceptually. Will noticed him first. RJ followed. Electra tensed immediately, because Remy was no longer just a background figure in emotional conflict. He had become something else entirely. A variable that kept reappearing at structurally significant moments. "What are you doing here?" RJ asked immediately. Remy glanced at him briefly, then at Will, then passed them toward the emergency ward. "I heard there was a medical issue," he said calmly. Will narrowed his eyes slightly. "Ow!" Remy did not answer that directly. Instead, he said something that shifted the conversation entirely. "I might be able to help." The doctors were skeptical at first. Understandably so. Hospitals do not operate on coincidence or convenience. But when Remy agreed to testing and the results came back within minutes, skepticism turned into immediate urgency. Compatible. Perfect match. The only available donor within reach. The only viable option. Will did not like the timing. He did not like the structure. He did not like the way Remy appeared repeatedly at critical intersections of events involving people already entangled in emotional and corporate instability. But he also understood something unavoidable. Without him, Melissa would die. The transfusion began shortly after. Remy lay in a separate room, connected to the system, calm in a way that did not match the emotional weight of the situation. Will watched from the doorway, for a long time. Then finally spoke. "This isn't random," he said quietly. Remy turned his head slightly. "No," he replied. "It isn't." That answer should have clarified something. Instead, it deepened uncertainty. Meanwhile, Electra stood in silence near the corridor window, watching the city outside. RJ approached her slowly. "You don't trust him," he said. Electra didn't look at him. "I don't trust anything right now," she replied. That was closer to truth than anyone wanted to admit. Because trust, in environments saturated with repeated deception, does not simply erode. It reclassifies everything as potential manipulation. Hours later, Melissa stabilized. The transfusion worked. Her condition improved from critical to stable, though still fragile. The hospital staff called it a successful intervention under extraordinary circumstances. But what they did not yet understand was that the intervention itself was only the surface layer of a much deeper shift. Because the moment Remy's blood entered Melissa's system, something else entered the narrative as well. Information. Genetic testing had been ordered as part of emergency protocol, not for curiosity, but for compatibility verification. And what the results revealed did not stay within the medical department for long. Because hospital data, especially in cases involving rare biological markers, does not remain contained when institutional overlaps exist. And Forrester Creations had deep historical overlaps with many institutions. Ridge Forrester was the first to receive a call, then Steffi, then, indirectly, Bill Spencer, and finally Will, because the data was no longer just medical. It was genealogical. Remy Price was not just a compatible donor. He was biologically linked to a lineage that intersected with historical Forrester corporate records in a way that had never been publicly disclosed. Not directly, but structurally, through ancestral documentation, through concealed inheritance pathways that had been buried under decades of corporate restructuring. And the implication was immediate. Remy Price was not outside the system. He had always been inside it. The revelation landed first in silence, then disbelief, then recalibration. Because lineage in families like Forrester and Spencer is not just personal. It is structural authority. It defines influence. It defines inheritance. It defines who belongs inside decision-making frameworks and who does not. Electra read the preliminary report twice before speaking. "This doesn't make sense," she said finally. RJ frowned. "What part?" She hesitated. "All of it," but was already thinking differently. Because if Remy was biologically tied to dormant or undisclosed branches of legacy structure, then his presence in Melissa's life was not accidental. It was positional, and positional presence always implies purpose. When Melissa regained full consciousness, she was unaware of the larger implications at first. She only knew she was alive. Weak, disoriented, but alive. Remy visited her briefly. No dramatics, no explanation, just presence. And when she saw him, something in her expression changed. Recognition mixed with confusion. "You," she whispered. Remy nodded slightly. "I know," he said quietly, but he did not elaborate. Not yet. Outside, Will stood with Bill Spencer as the implications unfolded. "This changes everything," Bill said slowly. Will did not respond immediately, because change, in his experience, was not singular. It was layered. "If his lineage connects where we think it does," Bill continued, "then control structures inside Forrester aren't what they've been pretending to be." Will finally spoke. "Then someone has been hiding inheritance pathways." Bill nodded once. "And now they're exposed." Electra, meanwhile, sat alone for a long time that night, not processing emotion, but processing instability. Because everything she had believed about interpersonal conflict, love, rivalry, trust, was now embedded within something much larger. Corporate inheritance structures, hidden lineage claims, biological coincidence that did not feel like coincidence anymore. And at the center of it all, Melissa Dillon. Alive, but no longer just a patient. A pivot point. RJ found her later. "You're thinking too much," he said gently. Electra looked at him. "I don't think that's possible anymore," she replied. And she meant it. because thinking had stopped being optional. It had become survival logic. In the hospital, Melissa finally asked the question that would shift everything again. "Why did he help me?" she asked softly. Remy stood near the window for a moment before answering. "Because you matter," he said. But the way he said it suggested that matter did not refer to emotion. It referred to structure, to position, to consequence. And somewhere in that moment, as Melissa recovered and Remy's identity began to crystallize within larger institutional frameworks, something irreversible took shape across Los Angeles. The realization that the crisis surrounding Forster Creations, Spencer Enterprises, and the Logan family was no longer just emotional or corporate. It was foundational. And foundations, once exposed,